All right. This is sort of written as though it were the first thing that we were going to say, so I'm still Davey. This is still Seth. And who's ready to learn? Good. At least one person's ready to learn. All right. So you want to be a front-end developer? Are you aware that that's basically the topic of the boot camp? Front-end development? Very good. So what does that even mean? The one on the right, right? That's front-end. Front-end versus back-end. To get even more help from Google Images, it looks like front-end developers make flat, pastel-colored things for, looks like desktops, laptops, and mobile devices. Flat, pastel colors, if you're lucky, with some logos floating around the screen. Let's take a closer look at some of those logos. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. What do these three things have in common? To be more specific, what do they have in common with each other that they don't have in common with these? What do the ones on the left have in common with each other that they don't have in common with the ones on the right? But the ones on the left are front end. Yeah, that's not the answer I'm looking for. What makes them front end? Yes, Jules?
The browser. They're connected to...
I heard something about a browser in there. Yeah. Also true. Thank you. So, they run in the browser, right? Browsers know just what to do with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They don't know what the crap to do with Ruby, Python, PHP, .NET, and Java. Java and JavaScript, same thing, right? No. Cuss no. Good. So one possible definition of front end is that it consists of anything that web browsers can interpret without any extra help. If you want a more technical definition, the front end refers to things that run on the client, while back end refers to things that run on the server. But we're focusing on the web for right now, so for our purposes, the client is the web browser. Well, slow down there, Grandpa. What's this World Wide Web business? We don't know. We only know about the Snapchats and the Yik Yaks. What's this web? It sounds like something for the elderly, like people in their 30s. Gross. Well, what if I told you that your beloved Snapchat is delivered by that very same infrastructure that we call the World Wide Web? Right? Huh? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this so-called World Wide Web and how it works. And you too will know as much as this stock photo model and this guy who thought that his Palm Pilot bulky cell phone and 45-pound CRT displays would look cool much longer than they did. But he also thought he'd have hair much longer than he did. But anyway, the web. We were talking about the web. When you visit a website, you type a URL or a search term into your browser, right? That sends a request from your computer to that big cloud we call the internet, or more specifically, a little corner of the internet called the World Wide Web. Eventually, that request ends up at a server where heaven knows what happens on the server. It may just grab a file from storage. It may run an entire application written in Python or Ruby or Java or C#.NET or something like that. Back-end development's writing all that stuff that runs inside the question mark. But whatever it does, eventually it sends back a response. The response could contain almost anything. It could be a zip file, it could be an error page. But most of the time, it's one of the handful of things that your browser can read without any additional software. Chiefly HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. So again, the server may be running some Python application whose output happens to be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. A backend developer will write that business and make sure that the output is the stuff that you built, the aforementioned HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, or cat photos, but that's pretty much all that your web browser understands. It could also be video or audio, but if your web page autoplays that crap, then you are basically summoning the devil like Mr. Spock here. Your guess is as good as mine. But it's probably HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or Lil Bub. And only one of those things is a programming language. Lil Bub! No, Lil Bub isn't a programming language. She's a cat. It's JavaScript, your new best friend. So front-end development is building all the stuff that gets sent in the response. All the stuff that the web browser will interpret and display. Including, yes, dear old JavaScript. You want to learn more about JavaScript? Yeah. Why? Why? I have it on good authority that JavaScript totally sucks. Over 2 million results for JavaScript sucks. And look down here, Casey What's-His-Face there is a master programmer, and he doesn't mince words. Why do so many people seem to hate JavaScript? Because it sucks, right? Silly question. Sucks so much there are 2 million pages devoted to its suckitude. So why use it? Reason number 1, you don't have a choice. It's the only programming language that these cussers understand. If you want to do front-end programming on the web, JavaScript is the only game in town. You could use Elm or TypeScript or Dart or CoffeeScript or something like that, but only because they ultimately get turned into JavaScript. Reason number 2, it's actually pretty good now. These 2 million results, they're from last year. We're down to 1.5 million now. Furthermore, this is better than it sounds, all of the top 6 results from last year were actually putting forth the notion that JavaScript sucks. But look at these. Number 1 is from whydoesitsuck.com, a site where everything sucks. And even they hedge by mentioning JavaScript's bright future in the title. A terrible language with a bright future, which is actually a very fair description of JavaScript. So, if a site where everything sucks is the top result for your sucking, then maybe it's not so bad. Number 2 is from Your Language Sucks, a wiki page that again lists what sucks about every single programming language you can think of. So the top 2 results could be the top 2 results for any language, very easily. The next one just says that learning JavaScript sucks. Probably because they didn't learn it from Seth and me, right? And anyway, he says it's awesome that it's hard to learn JavaScript. People complain that it's hard now because it's improving so rapidly, and there are a ton of frameworks that are constantly changing, but that's a nice problem to have. You can't just learn one library or framework and think that you've learned all you'll ever need to know. Now it's like other languages in that isn't adequate, and it kind of used to be. The author of this next post is actually a huge proponent of learning JavaScript. The word sucks appears twice in the post, once saying that it's possible that your local job market sucks, and once saying that a lot of JavaScript training sucks, but again, he's never been to Extern Boot Camp, so. All right, the next one says that if you hate JavaScript, it's due to ignorance. Number 6 is from Reddit, so let's not take it too seriously. Plus, nearly all of the comments on that link are saying that the article is a load of this emoji. And as the comment that's excerpted here says, OMG, I don't understand JavaScript, therefore it sucks. So, yeah, maybe it's not so bad now. Last year, yeah, sure, there were more people making a case. But it is true that a lot of programmers despise JavaScript. But in many cases, it really is because they don't take the time to actually learn it. There were some unfortunate decisions made early on in JavaScript's history that we still have to deal with. It definitely says something that one of the most popular books on the language is called JavaScript: The Good Parts, and it's not very thick. But a lot of people just don't like JavaScript because it doesn't behave like language X, whatever they're used to, right? For example, JavaScript is a semicolons and curly braces language. And we've seen those before, right? That C on the left, that's Java in the lower right. And JavaScript kind of looks like those. Unfortunately, it doesn't work a thing like those. And if you've been writing JavaScript since even the early 2000s, never mind the mid-90s, then you remember a time when it was truly miserable to work with. Miles here is my business partner, and this was his first tweet ever. Last year, they released a thing where you could look up your first tweet. This was his, loving my job and hating JavaScript. But that was 9 years ago, when hating JavaScript was actually kind of a pretty reasonable position to take. And I think even he would admit that he hated it in large part because it wasn't Ruby. It definitely is not Ruby. So, who wants to learn JavaScript now? You still in? All right, good attitude, Jules. Sure, there were over 2 million pages saying it sucks a year ago, but I found 9 million results for Star Wars sucks. So, maybe don't listen to the internet. So, how did we get here? Come with me on a magical journey to 1989. The Berlin Wall came down. Nintendo released the Game Boy. Batman and Indiana Jones ruled the box office. And that was the last Indiana Jones movie they ever made. Yes, it was. Shut up. I still had hair. And at the CERN Particle Physics Laboratory, future home of the Large Hadron Collider, this guy, Tim Berners-Lee, created the World Wide Web, and with it, the HTTP protocol and HTML. He created it for sharing scientific documents in hypertext, the HT in HTML. What does hypertext do? What's the idea behind hypertext? What's the point? It allows documents to link to one another. That's basically what it's all about. And that's still fundamentally what the web is. Only those linked documents can contain a lot more than just text. But in the beginning, there was only hypertext. So let's fast forward to 1991, when they made the last Terminator movie that anyone would ever make. I still had hair. Hey, who can tell what game I'm playing? Hey, who said Mario 3? All right. Correctamundo. And good old Tim made his creation available to the world with a humble newsgroup post. He launched it with a line mode browser that ran on pretty much anything, as well as a browser with a graphical interface and a built-in WYSIWYG editor. You know what WYSIWYG stands for? What you see is what you get. Yeah, so you could type it and it would show you, the way that it actually looks in the browser. So that browser, that first graphical browser, was called World Wide Web. Clever name. Later renamed Nexus. And it was written in Objective-C and ran on NextStep, the operating system for Next workstations, the brainchild of this turtleneck-wearing fella who had been fired from Apple. But Next computers were really freaking expensive and not all that widely used. So the web was still pretty esoteric. So in 1992, when I suddenly had long blonde hair, this guy told Tim he was thinking of writing a web browser for the X Window system, which would allow it to run on a lot more Unix machines. Tim said, good idea. So we made a new browser called Viola, which you've never heard of. Yes, Viola. It added exciting new features such as tables, embedding web pages in other web pages, a scripting language to add interactivity to pages, a syntax for style sheets. All in all, a huge leap forward, but it still only ran on Unix, and absolutely none of that technology survived to any other browsers. But hey, he tried. Fast forward to 1993, by which point I was the single most awkward organism on the planet. At the Legal Information Institute at Cornell, they had made the first website about the law. And lawyers were like, it's a Unix system. I know this. No, just kidding. They were all like, law what? So this guy at the Institute was like, JK, I made a browser for Windows. And the lawyers were like, hype. And this new browser was called Cello. Get it? Viola, Cello. That's right. Cello was the first web browser for Windows 3.1. This changed everything. Hey, web browsers, step forward if you're relevant. Not so fast, Cello. You see, at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, the NCSA at the University of Illinois, the birthplace of HAL 9000 in fiction, these guys, who were students at the time, developed a web browser called Mosaic! Who's heard of Mosaic? Okay, somebody. It's more than heard of viola or cello, right? Yes, Mosaic was a legitimately big deal. Like Viola, it was a graphical browser for Unix. Unlike Viola, it was very quickly ported to other operating systems, including Windows and Macintosh. And it was relatively easy to install and use. And that was crucial, as there were more people interested in using the web than ever before. In some respects, the evolution of the web actually took some steps backwards with Mosaic, whereas Viola applied formatting via style sheets, keeping presentation separate from content and structure. Mosaic just added a bunch of new HTML elements like center, BR, BU, HR, and image, just in time for 1994, when my nerdy friends and I still had hair, and those other three jerks still do, and the information superhighway was all over the news. Anderson Cooper told all us high school kids about it on Channel 1 News. And it was time for people to start figuring out how to make money with it. So back at the NCSA, where Mosaic was developed, Spyglass was a for-profit spin-off of the NCSA. Basically, Spyglass existed for the purpose of commercializing things that were developed at the University of Illinois, making money from them. So they began working on a commercial version of Mosaic. At the same time, however, this guy, Mosaic's original author, started a company, taking most of the Mosaic team with him. He called it Mosaic Communications until the NCSA was like, the Mosaic name's ours, buddy. So they gave their new version a code name, suggesting that their new browser was the Mosaic Killer. 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 The Mosaic. Mozilla! Hey, Uncle Dave, I've actually heard of that. All right. Yes, Mozilla. Mark and his friends adopted Mozilla as their mascot, but the browser itself ended up being called what? You said it earlier. Netscape, that's right. Netscape Navigator was released in October of 1994, implementing a ton of new features and very quickly rendering all other browsers irrelevant. So irrelevant that developers started inspecting the user agent string that gets sent with the request. So remember the diagram where it goes from your laptop to a thing? That request, in addition to containing the URL that you requested, it also sends some information about the client that you're using or the user agent. And this is how this is how Netscape identified itself as Mozilla 1.0. And so back-end folks, there wasn't really any front-end beyond HTML at this point. So back-end folks started looking for that string to decide whether they were even going to bother sending stuff down, because they very specifically designed these things for Netscape. Spyglass, meanwhile, was licensing their version of Mosaic, because remember, they actually had the rights to the original Mosaic. Netscape had to build theirs from scratch. They licensed it to who? Not Paul Rudd. Microsoft. That's right. Player 3 has entered the game. Yes, Microsoft put a team of 6 to work enhancing Spyglass Mosaic and giving it that Microsoft flavor. Which brings us to 1995, when my hair reached its maximum strength, and it looks like I did a cover shoot for Young Republicans Quarterly or something that I've forgotten. Turtleneck Guy's other company made a movie about toys, and Alanis Morissette was ticked off, and Bill Gates and his start menu were masters of the universe. So he and his pals at Microsoft were ready to show their fork of Mosaic to the world. You know it as... Everybody now? A miserable pile of garbage called Internet Explorer, available in the Microsoft Plus companion for Windows 95. IE was pretty much just Mosaic dressed up like Windows 95 at that point, but the Netscape folks had been busy adding loads of new features. Internet Explorer didn't even support tables in the first release. They didn't even have that blue E icon yet. And they just labeled it the Internet. And seriously, forget what you know about Internet Explorer 11 or Edge. The first 2 releases of IE had no redeeming qualities. They were garbage. But everyone just used the browser that was on the floppy that their ISP provided, which was virtually always Netscape anyway. Remember the user agent string that a browser sends? Well, this is what the one for Internet Explorer looked like. That's right. It reported itself as Mozilla, with the truth in parentheses later on, so it wouldn't get ignored when folks were sniffing the user agent string. And guess what? Every browser still does that. Chrome, Safari, all of them. Every modern user agent string begins with Mozilla. And these days, they all also list WebKit, KHTML, Gecko, and Safari too. Anyone guess what web browser this is actually the user agent string for? It happens to be Edge in Windows 10. It even throws Chrome in there for good measure. Everything's listed in there. Guys, it's a bad idea to sniff for the user agent string because everyone's going to lie about it anyway, and you shouldn't be targeting specific browsers. You can target specific technologies, but look for support for those technologies, not specific browsers, because for one thing, things change over time, and you may not update every single website you've ever made. But make sure that your stuff basically works everywhere anyway. Anyway, I know you were promised JavaScript, and we haven't gotten there yet. Please, just bear with me. We're in 1995, right? When Generation X was the absolute worst. So if you ever feel picked on, guys, remember, every generation is the absolute worst to the generation older. So, killing America's soul. Look at that. Look at that 20-something thing. Laid back, late blooming, or just lost. Overshadowed by the baby boomers, America's next generation has a hard act to follow. They were saying it about everybody. Anyway, in 95, that was the year that the web became widely available to mere mortals, and the commercial web was a very real thing. Amazon and Yahoo first appeared. CNET launched with a yellow sidebar that every other site on the web decided they needed to copy. Seriously, you can't imagine how influential that thing was. They were even making movies about hackers in 1995. Boot up or shut up. Online this fall. Online. See, this is cutting edge stuff, guys. It's online. Aw, cuss. But that also meant that it was time that someone needed to make us afraid of this new technology. Who will think of the children, after all? There have been a lot of Time Magazine covers in this slideshow. It's good to know that 20 years later, we can still count on them for super relevant, hard-hitting news like 15 awesome ideas for how to eat chia seeds. But anyway, back to the days when they were throwing cyber in front of everything. Web developers, which was suddenly a real job, were asking how to add interactivity to their pages. Hypertext was neat and all, but we had new tricks like tiled background images and GIFs, which were clearly a fad and have no place in today's internet. But web monkeys wanted to add interactivity beyond hyperlinks. The answer came in the form of plugins like Java Applets, QuickTime VR, and Macromedia Shockwave. Incredibly, Shockwave is still maintained by Adobe. Even more incredibly, the Space Jam website is still online. They only changed the URL to have archive in it this year. I went back to the URL a month or so ago, and it wasn't there, but they just moved it. So they finally moved it, but it's still there, by golly. So we had interactive content, even games in web browsers, but interactivity via browser plugins was still a pretty poor experience. The plugins had to be installed, they were security risk, they were painfully slow, and they couldn't actually interact with any of the HTML elements on the page. Fortunately, a team of scientists at Netscape were hard at work on a scripting language that would run directly in the browser. Okay, they weren't really scientists. Okay, it was just this one dude, and he spent a whole 10 days on it. But, by golly, he did it, and it was called, you guessed it, Mocha! That's the name that his boss suggested. He really wanted to remind people of that other hot new platform that was named after coffee. But a few months later, in September 1995, they came up with a better name. And finally, we had LiveScript. Okay, that name didn't last very long either. In December, Netscape worked out a deal with Sun Microsystems, which had created the trendiest new platform in town, Java. And thanks to this new trademark licensing agreement, which confuses people to this day, Netscape could call their new language what? JavaScript, despite having only the most superficial of similarities to Java. In any case, JavaScript now existed and could be used far and wide, at least by people who were using the latest version of Netscape and who had JavaScript enabled in their preferences. But JavaScript had arrived, and because the name JavaScript wasn't confusing enough, when Microsoft reverse engineered it and added it to Internet Explorer, they called it JScript. They weren't going to pay that. They weren't going to make a deal with Sun. Those guys are jerks. So, you with me so far? All right. Over the next couple of years, an organization called ECMA, that's the European Country Music Association. That can't be right. No. The European Chamber Music Academy. No? The European Cylinder Makers Association? No, just kidding, guys. It's Étude de conception de machine automatique. No? No. Okay, this is getting silly. It's obviously the Electronic Collar Manufacturers Association. Okay. The East Coast Music Association, Canadian music, East Coast style. That's what I'm talking about. Okay. It's really a standards body called the European Computer Manufacturers Association. And over the next couple of years, they worked on standardizing JavaScript. And they called it ECMAScript. So for the last 20 years, ECMAScript has been the official standard of which JavaScript is the primary implementation. When we talk about the standard, it's ECMAScript. When we talk about the language, it's JavaScript. So now that we've got our names straight, what back then could JavaScript actually do? HTML could define the content on a web page and its basic presentation, but JavaScript could dictate behavior. You could do real programming with it. You could use JavaScript to generate additional HTML, even. You could put a calculator on a web page. This is online, too. You could make images change by hovering your mouse over them. Bonus points if you had no idea what they linked to until after you hovered. This is not online. I may have found this buried on an external hard drive, despite the fact that no one I know would have built such an atrocity in the 90s. If you were a bank with a ridiculous skeuomorphic website design that looks like an ATM, and I can't imagine who would have designed something so tasteless, then you could offer not just a calculator, but a mortgage calculator. This is not online either. It's on an external hard drive where it can't hurt any money. But besides calculators and ever-popular mouse over images, one of the handiest uses of JavaScript was to validate form data before users submitted it. It was and is a great way to give people instant feedback without a round trip to the server. Now, does that eliminate the need to check submitted data on the server side? Heck, fire no. Don't forget to do that. If you're ever tempted to validate data in the browser only, think again. Nevertheless, client-side validation was great and convenient. But as with any new technology, there were those who would use it for evil. Yes, with JavaScript, the pop-up ad was born. Gee, thanks, JavaScript. So everything was terrible. The web was becoming a nightmare, not just because of pop-up ads, but because an increasingly large number of sites only worked in one browser on one platform. In those days, Netscape and IE didn't just compete on user interface features. They each added their own non-standard HTML elements and other features. IE had Marquee. Netscape had Blink. Our lives were enriched. Competition had fostered such innovation. No, it was terrible. Both had significant market share and had developed wildly different object models. IE had document.all, Netscape had document.layers, so if a site did anything so much as add a pull-down menu with JavaScript, it probably had to be written twice. Welcome to the first browser war. If you were cool, you put nifty little buttons on your site to let people know which browser to download. Aside from different APIs for JavaScript, each browser also had major features that were just plain absent in the other. And once Internet Explorer 4.0 was bundled with Windows, it quickly became the single most widely used browser. But at least Spyglass was getting paid, right, at the University of Illinois, since it was based on Mosaic? Just kidding. Since Microsoft bundled it with Windows for free, they didn't have to pay royalties. Okay, so they did get sued, and they settled for a measly $8 million. But anyway, Internet Explorer began to dominate, and it introduced its own features, such as ActiveX. ActiveX allowed native compiled Windows code to be included in web pages. That obviously opened up a lot of possibilities as long as you were willing to ignore every non-Windows user, which a lot of businesses were perfectly willing to do. So the web was starting to become just another delivery mechanism for Windows code. And thanks to the fact that Outlook Express, also included in every copy of Windows, used the Internet Explorer engine to display messages, email could run native code. What could go wrong? Lots of stuff went wrong, and computer worms did billions of dollars in damage. And sometimes just previewing a message was enough to wreck everything. What were we talking about again? Oh yeah, ActiveX. So, why did companies use it since it broke the internet and was catastrophically insecure? Well, it did offer some enticing behavior, including one really neat thing that would eventually catch on and be adopted by other browsers in a pure JavaScript form. That was called XML HTTP request, often shortened to XHR. and it made its debut in Outlook Web Access with Microsoft Exchange Server 2000. It allowed a web page to get additional data from the server after page load without refreshing the entire page. And despite the name, data was not limited to XML. It really had nothing to do with XML. It was just a mechanism for asynchronous requests. Asynchronous. You may have heard of it by a different name. In 2005, Jesse James Garrett from Adaptive Path wrote a blog post describing a way of designing web interactions using XHR, and he called it Ajax. In those days, we still had to deal with wildly different syntax for this and even basic operations that dealt with the contents of a page. Using JavaScript in combination with HTML and CSS, in those days, we sometimes called DHTML. And there were libraries that managed to work in all the major browsers at the time. Then, as now, supporting earlier versions of Internet Explorer was the hardest. But Microsoft, by then, was finally talking about adopting standards. But old versions hung around for a painfully long time. Netscape usage had thankfully dipped below 0.5% by that time. And Firefox, which was sort of Netscape's successor, designed from scratch to implement standards, was rising fast. Still, those DHTML libraries were essential, and they were kind of awful because they took forever to download because they were huge, and they weren't very pleasant to work with. But pretty soon, in 2006, several new JavaScript libraries showed up that handled cross-platform compatibility in a much more pleasant way, even Ajax stuff. New challengers have since arisen, and they all do their best these days to implement standards, and they all even self-update, which is also nice. And they even have built-in tools for developing JavaScript, debuggers and such. And HTML5 offers new APIs that we can use with JavaScript to do some new things, as well as to do some old things faster. And JavaScript got a major overhaul with ECMAScript 2015, aka ES6, and it has continued to improve since then. We're not really going to mess with ES5 or older in this course. We're just going to use ES6 and newer and embrace the future. And now we have about 1 million libraries and full-blown frameworks that let us build fancy JavaScript apps. Old versions of Internet Explorer remain the hardest for front-end developers to deal with, as they're still a shocking running Windows XP. And Internet Explorer 8, released 7 years ago, was the last version to support XP. And those who never updated past Windows XP SP1 are still stuck with IE7. Internet Explorer eventually earned a bad enough rap that Microsoft dropped the name entirely and called their browser, of course, Edge. But all modern browsers are pretty okay for our purposes. We'll be using Google Chrome in class because Seth and I are most familiar with its developer tools, but the projects we build ought to run in the latest version of any of the big four browsers. So no one knows for sure what the future holds, but the future of front-end development looks pretty bright. It's taken a while to get here, but it's a pretty exciting time to be creating things for the web, and JavaScript itself has never been better. Are you with me? Yep. Woo! JavaScript! Ow!